Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world, and a lot of things to talk about. We're seeing a perfect storm, an energy crunch in Europe, heat waves throughout the Northern Hemisphere from China to Texas, and the growing evidence that climate change is not something we can wait for. It's here with us already. Then we'll take a look at President Biden and President Putin's trips to the Middle East. Putin went to Tehran, Biden went to Israel and Saudi Arabia. What did they get out of it? And finally, a look at Sri Lanka, where a new president is going to try to get the country that is on the verge of collapse back on its own legs. Here to talk about all of this week is Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. Bureau Chief of the Straits Times. Nirmal, great to see you.
Nice to be back.
Always, also with us for the first time, Amna Nawaz, who is the chief correspondent at the PBS NewsHour and a contributor to MSNBC News. Amna, great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Great. And Elise Labott, longtime contributor, back again. Elise is the founder and CEO of Zivvy Media and a contributing editor at POLITICO magazine. Elise, as always, great to see you again as well.
Good to see you again, Ivo.
Amna, let's start with you on this perfect storm. You couldn't have predicted it all come together. The entire Northern Hemisphere, as I said, from China to Texas and Oklahoma, having 100+ degree Fahrenheit weather, much of Europe suffering the same thing. A crunch on energy with high prices and reduced volume, and sort of emphasizing that we really are experiencing climate change in a way we haven't seen before. Bring us up to date on sort of the big issues that happened this week along that line to emphasize what is really going on here and why this is not just a one time, but something we were going to have to live with.
Ivo, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we are living the climate crisis right now. And I think even though climate scientists have been modeling this kind of thing for years. Experts I've talked to have said this was in their projections. They saw this coming. Many were surprised by how fast we got there, especially when you were seeing what was happening across much of Northern Europe. I mean, we can't say this enough. We're talking about sustained temperatures over 100 degrees, some of the highest temperatures they've seen since that kind of modern record keeping began over a century and a half ago. The kind of temperatures that are sparking wildfires across the region, that are straining infrastructure. You're talking about airport runways melting, bridges buckling, hospitalizations surging, hundreds dying. I mean, this is the crisis. We are living the climate future everyone has been worried about right now. And I think, as you mentioned, this is not the exception. What the experts will tell you is that we will increasingly see more and more episodes and more heat waves like this. So there's the short term, what we're living through right now. There's the medium term. You're going to have an impact on harvests and droughts and so on. And there is the long term, which is the likelihood of reaching these temperatures in the future more frequently will also grow. Here's the thing. We know what we need to do. We have long known what we need to do to avoid this or to pull these back from the frequency at which scientists now say we should expect to experience them. We need to get to net zero emissions. We need to shift off fossil fuels. Those long-term goals have bumped up against the short-term realities. And those realities are not just standing in the way right now. They're really, in some ways, pulling leaders and governments in the opposite direction. What do I mean by that? Well, obviously, Russia's war in Ukraine has completely changed the global landscape and has completely changed, in particular, Europe's plans for shifting off of fossil fuels. Germany, I think, is the best example, right? They heavily rely on Russia as a source of natural gas. And even though they have massively shifted off of that reliance, I think down from like 55% to 35% just since the start of the war, that is not a switch you just flip, and that happens overnight. And what we're seeing now is basically this, this is exposed. Nations' over-reliance on Russian natural gas and oil. The conflict in Ukraine is clearly not just limited to Ukraine. It is, as you said, a perfect storm, and there's no short-term immediate solution to it.
Thanks, Amna. That's really a great summary and frightening in so many ways. And Nirmal, when you look at the debate in Washington, Everybody knows this is real. Everybody knows it's happening. From the climate deniers are sort of left the field. And yet, what do we have in Washington? A climate bill was torpedoed just a week ago, and nothing is going to happen on the climate change, at least as far as a legislative effort is going to be forthcoming. And if Washington doesn't lead on this, how's the rest of the world going to respond?
Yes, absolutely. Total paralysis in Washington. It's not, and really, I mean, we're looking at the midterms in just a few months. And if the Democratic Party loses, which seems likely, loses its majority in the House, then there's going to be nothing for another 2 years. And then if a new dispensation comes in, who knows what's going to happen. But yeah, and coincidentally, just a few days ago, I was writing about this, I don't know if you've heard or read about it, the Ike Dike, this massive coastal spine project that they're putting up over 70 miles of the Texas coast to protect Galveston and so forth, from storm surges. And this is $31 billion. It's going to take something like 18 years to build. It's the largest engineering project that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would have ever, civilian engineering project, it would have ever undertaken, but there's no money for it. So we are looking at a future of still in the mindset of looking at large engineering solutions to ward off the effects, the sort of mounting effects of climate change without doing anything to essentially address the root causes. Yes, President Biden has announced some executive actions. He will do so, but these are all going to be quite marginal. They will not really make a significant difference to emissions. We have a few slivers of hope here and there. For example, the U.S. Postal Service, which has a massive fleet, just said that they're going to turn the 40% of the fleet electronic and all. But again, this is around the margins. And if Congress does not legislate, then basically there's not enough money to deal with the consequences of climate change that we are seeing.
Well, and Nirmal, just to emphasize the importance of Congress legislating, of course, the Supreme Court, in one of its last acts before it went on summer recess, made it impossible for the EPA or indeed an executive agency to start dealing with climate change without legislative imprimatur. So it's a tough issue. In the meantime, Elise, just on the European side, where Europe has very ambitious targets for dealing with climate change, and in many ways have moved forward. The gas crisis and the energy crisis that Amna talked about is leading countries to start burning coal and ignite and other places. At the exact same time that they're suffering a heat wave, they're starting to pump more fossil fuels into the atmosphere. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, I don't think it's going to play out well, particularly in other countries where they're looking for leadership from the European Union, which is supposed to be one of the leaders in terms of the move towards alternative fuels and green energy. And as Amna said, they're bumping against short-term needs and long-term goals. But, you just heard the South African development minister say, principles and this leadership is only important when it's not convenient for you. I mean, when it's convenient, fine, but they're looking for leadership now. And so you see other countries that smaller countries, less developed countries that are being pushed to reduce fossil fuels, move towards green energy. They're saying, well, you first. And so I think this is the problem, the short-term crisis that we're having, whether it's, the heat waves, the need for more electricity, gas shortages, all of this is rubbing up against the stated goals of the European Union in particular, to move forward on some of these alternative fuels and green energies. And you even saw in Germany, as Amna said, the environment minister was one of the people there who was one of the leaders on all of this move towards alternative fuels and green energies. And now it's instituting policies that are moving backwards because Germany and the European Union at large is rubbing up against these short-term crises.
Exactly. I'm not, as Elise mentions, the energy and economics and climate minister, is the leader of the Green Party, which came to power to push for a climate change agenda, and now he's opening coal plants. But because of the short-term circumstances. Perhaps the silver lining, though, is that it is forcing this transition away from Russian dependence on Russian gas, and that ultimately, if you don't have gas and enough fossil fuels, you probably have to do it with more renewables. And so maybe it's a hard bridge to go through, and maybe the South African development minister's right, that this is the time to sort of bite the bullet, see where you can go, and then hopefully on the other side you come out and there's some hope. Would you share that? Is that how you think that this might turn out, that in some ways Russia in the short term is a bad thing, but in the long term it may work out in the way we would like to see it work out?
So I am a relentless optimist just in life. It's a weird thing to be in this line of work, I think. But I'll tell you this, just based on reporting and conversations I've had. When the war in Ukraine began, a number of senior European officials, German officials in particular, made very clear that this was the green light for them that said, we are more committed than ever to getting off our reliance on Russian energy. And this will speed up that process. And they passed a number of steps and laws that meant that they would actually accelerate that process of doing so. So that is the long term. Yes, they know what they're moving towards. And Europe, to be clear, for as much as America has said they want to be the leader in this space, it's really the European nations that have been the leader when it comes to transitioning into renewables. But this short term that they are going through right now means they're firing back up coal plants. They are loosening environmental restrictions to quickly build up some of those LNG, the liquefied natural gas terminals. They are trying to find that LNG anywhere and everywhere they can, which means going to nations in the Gulf and other places. And that brings into it a whole nother sort of paradigm and balance of power in the global landscape. And they're also dealing with domestic pressures. So when you're talking about their history of, they've powered Europe's biggest economy on the back of energy they've been getting from Russia. They're asking their domestic population now to make sacrifices, to start rationing. They're trying to build back up those supplies ahead of winter because they're worried about those shortages. They do not have what they need right now to get through the winter. And I think that's another concern here is how long will people in Germany back this? How long will they be willing to go through this, as you said, this short-term difficulty towards those long-term gains? And that is a very careful balance. We don't know how that's going to shake out.
Well, I just want to chirp in on what Amna was saying. I mean, these are countries that have already faced a lot of austerity measures because of all the extra money that countries have paid for COVID, for pandemic relief, for social services over these years. And it's really not, we're talking about Europe, which obviously is in a financial and energy crisis, but it's really going to punish the world's poorest citizens. In Africa, 25 million people are living without electricity now compared with before the pandemic. Some of these countries that are facing not only the energy crisis and fuel shortages, but food prices because not only of the pandemic, but because of the war in Ukraine. So as you said, you really advertised it well, even when you said this perfect storm. It's a perfect storm for Europe, indeed, and even here in the United States. But really what it's going to affect is some of the most poorest and underdeveloped nations.
Yeah, and the reality, just Nirmal, to add to that, if you're not going to buy Russian gas and you're going to buy gas somewhere else, that means that gas is not going to go to countries that need it. So if the Germans can pay more for gas from Qatar or Australia or whatever, other countries are not going to be able to get that gas. And the reality is, gas, except for if you liquefy it, it's got to go and run through pipelines, and those pipelines run to Europe. And if there's no gas from Russia going to Europe, it's just sitting in the ground in Russia and not helping the larger problem. So I think Elise is right to point out that the externality is not just Europe or the immediacy. It's the whole world that is going to be affected. Globalization may have ended in some ways, but not when it comes to these kinds of issues.
Yes, in fact, globalization was supposed to make us all interdependent and therefore stakeholders, and but now it's been weaponized.
Yeah, no, exactly, and we see that. But the weaponization is kind of interesting, right? It's not just Russia weaponizing it, but because of that, the externalities of that have a huge implication for Africa, for Latin America, the South Asia and even Southeast Asia, with the result that, for example, on the conflict of Ukraine, they're not necessarily seeing it the same way as the West is.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we've seen one topic we'll probably get to later on, or now, if you like, is Sri Lanka, and of course, you use the term perfect storm, and nowhere is that more applicable than to Sri Lanka, actually, where everything happened very quickly, one interlocking crises after the other, and the war in Ukraine absolutely did not help. It was, absolutely the final straw.
Yeah, we'll come back to that because it is a different perfect storm that is facing Sri Lanka, which is just a question that I think is going to affect not just Sri Lanka. It's a case to be examined for a larger lesson. Let's come back to that in a minute. In the meantime, Elise, President Putin and President Biden went to the Middle East. Biden came in and said the administration came in and said we can't afford to be drug into the Middle East as we have in the past, and yet here he was. What did he get out of the meeting, and importantly, what did Putin get out of a meeting with Turkey and Iran in Tehran? An important set of meetings that took place there too.
Well, okay, let's just unpack. There's a lot to unpack here. I mean, first of all, there's been a lot made of what did President Biden get from this trip. Obviously, this was a very controversial, let's just, get out of the way that he went to Israel. That was the easy part of the trip, right? Met with the Israelis, said, I'm home. They called him Brother Joseph. There was a lot of love there. I wouldn't say on the Palestinian issue that he really paid as much attention or any real attention to the needs of the Palestinians, but paid a lot of lip service to the U.S. looking to do more, gave some aid. But I would say the Palestinians were really the ones left empty-handed. On the Israel side, it was just a big wet kiss. So, that was the easy part. Then goes over to Saudi Arabia, very controversial trip. Obviously meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, after, promising to treat the state as a pariah. I think maybe that was a little, everyone likes to say a Biden gaffe. I think he really meant it in his heart, but the realities of governing are that the U.S. can't really ignore Saudi Arabia, which is a very important country in the region, an important global player, and particularly as Biden is looking to kind of reassert leadership after years of President Trump, really important to kind of line up not just Saudi Arabia, but the Gulf as the U.S. kind of fights this existential, battle with Russia and China on this global power, great power competition. So what did he get from the meeting? I think, he might have said there was obviously an issue on oil that the U.S. needs Saudi Arabia to increase production. We're paying for it at the pump. He wants to ease not just the fuel crisis here in the United States, but regulate oil markets around the world by getting the Saudis and the Gulf states to increase more. I think in his advisors' minds, this is more of a long-term agenda. Short-term deliverables, yes. The Saudis did agree to increase a little bit of production. And I think there is an unspoken agreement that we're going to see more and more small increases of production. August 3rd is a big OPEC meeting. We'll see what OPEC Plus, we'll see what producers set their prices there. But there is, an understanding that there will be a modest increase. On the Gulf side, they're saying, listen, you need to get your own house in order on energy production. We'll help you in the short term, but don't, ask us to continue to bail you out. I would say Biden got an understanding on the oil issue, and he also got an understanding from Gulf states in appreciation that he was there. I don't think he came with much, but I think the meeting was the message. The Gulf states said the meeting can't be the message, but I think at the end of the day, everyone was happy that he came. He reasserted, the U.S. commitment to the region, but he is facing and will continue to face a lot of criticism for that fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman. It was, they said that it was because of COVID. He was a little, touchier and warm feelies over in Israel. That really left a bad taste in the mind of, many critics and human rights activists, and rightly so. But I think the understanding is, even as the U.S. continues to push Saudi Arabia for greater reforms on human rights and other issues, it's just, the relationship is just too important. The country is just too important to put it at arm's length. And so it's not going to be a cozy relationship, but it will be a relationship. And it is very important to the United States, if it's the world superpower, if it wants to continue to lead. The realities of governing, you can say one thing on the campaign trail, but when you're the president and the leader of the free world, you just can't keep a country like Saudi Arabia at bay like that. So the trip was inevitable. Let's see what comes out of it.
We'll come back to the Putin trip in a minute, but let's focus on the Biden trip for a second. Amna, the senior administration officials are talking about the trip was about meetings, not greetings. They don't want to talk about fist bumps. Turned out that fist bumps doesn't prevent you getting COVID anyway, as the president has found out. But the criticism, not just from human rights leaders, but also from journalists. The publisher of the Washington Post wrote a really issued a scathing statement. And of course, much of the left of the Democratic Party has been very, very critical of the president. How does the administration and the president deal with the reality? I think Elise rightly lays out sort of the realpolitik case for why this trip needed to happen, and it was inevitable to happen. And yet they haven't been able to overcome the criticism, rightly so, given everything that the Saudis are responsible for, not least the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. How do they deal with this going forward?
I mean, in some ways, it is impossible to defend wholly, right? I mean, we have to remember then candidate Biden said that he would make Saudi a pariah state. And it is a total 180 to say, I'm going to make them a pariah and then grant them a presidential visit. And we just have to acknowledge that. And to be fair, the White House and administration have acknowledged that. We were in a different place and a different world, some would argue, back when he was saying those things. At the same time, if you say out loud, as President Biden has, human rights will be at the center of our foreign policy, and then you go meet one-on-one with the leader of a nation who is arguably, and intelligence has shown, behind the brutal murder of a US-based journalist, where they still carry out mass executions, where women do not enjoy the full rights of their male counterparts in the nation, where homosexuality is criminalized and punished. That's a tough line to walk for anyone. And this is, as Elise very rightly and eloquently laid out, this is about where we are. You said everyone in the region was glad he came. I think, as Elise pointed out, Palestinians were not happy with the way that it went. I think Iran did not enjoy that meeting very much. But the US is very clear about this. They cannot leave behind a vacuum in this region for Russia or China and Iran to fill. And when you talk to people who've served in the region, I'm thinking back to a conversation I had recently with former Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who used to serve in Iraq and Turkey. And he said, look, the greater existential threat here is from Russia and China. This is an acknowledgement of that you have to be able to work in this space. And that means meeting with people, as he said, that you may not like to have a drink with at the end of the day, but also acknowledging that you need them on your side. It's better to have them on your side than not. And that's where we are. Foreign policy, it's often said, like, you can choose maybe and decide who your enemy is, but you don't always get to decide who your friends are. And this is a perfect example of that. US officials have said very clearly in closed door meetings, Mohammed bin Salman is 36 years old. He is clearly in line. He is not going anywhere. And the US has to find a way to work with Saudi to be able to move forward US interests in the region and more broadly across the world.
Yeah, and just to underscore the difficulties, I haven't heard a lot of people criticizing the president for having a meeting with President Sisi of Egypt, who, by the way, has also jailed journalists and political opponents, and in large measures. So it is. I think Amna, as you say rightly, you can choose your enemies, but you can never not necessarily choose your friends, and that's the difficulty is there. Nirmal, I think the president's speech to the GCC+3 meeting, actually, if you read it, is a really remarkable statement about this point that Amna made. We cannot afford not to be engaged in the Middle East, because if we're not there, the Chinese will be there, and there's too much at stake, not just in oil, but in so many other things for us to allow the Chinese free reign in the Middle East, and sort of another realpolitik message that. As Kim Katz, when she's on our show, says, you can leave the Middle East, but the Middle East will never leave you. It's sort of the Las Vegas rule. Biden has learned it. It seems to me, and we're back fully engaged in the Middle East. How do the Chinese read it? Do they think they are losing an effort here to gain some influence, or are they going to bite their time and wait for the next administration to say that they're going to leave from the Middle East? How do you think they're looking at it?
Yeah, I don't think. I think the Chinese will just bide their time. I mean, they have other priorities. Of course, the biggest priority is Taiwan, and that is quite obvious. And then they have other issues as well. The South China Sea. They have their relationship with Russia to work out, and they're sort of on the same side ideologically, but it's an uneasy, sort of profoundly. It's a relationship full of landmines. But so they bide their time on the Middle East, and I sometimes feel I'm sometimes a little worried that everything that Biden does abroad is seen through the prism of the US-China lens, and it may not always necessarily be so. Of course, Russia is part of it, but really there's a tendency to see it in the China lens. And going back to what Elise was saying earlier, I think this is a case where domestic political exigencies sort of undermine foreign policy goals, right, or the foreign policy rhetoric. President Biden's approval rating is less than 40%, really low. He's got hammered by both the right and the left over this fist bump. Honestly, he would have looked bad either way. He had to sit down with Salman, with the Crown Prince, and have this meeting. He would have looked bad anyway. I'm not sure that the larger American public will care that much about the fist bump 3-4 months from now. But they will care if inflation goes down. If OPEC manages to produce, up production and oil prices go down, and there's some ease up in inflation in the US, that would have made the trip worth it for the president. Inflation was over 9% in last month, in June, which is tremendous. So I think it's a question of riding out the storm from the fist bump thing. It was inevitable. They had to go through with it. And as Amna said, the White House has been quite candid about it, that this is the reality that we have to face. We have to get on with Saudi Arabia.
Elise, meantime, another president left his country to travel to the Middle East, President Putin, to Tehran for a 3-way summit with the Iranians and the Turks. Fascinating idea for the president of Russia to go to Iran so he can buy some drones. Tells you a lot about where the state of Russian military is. But what else did you see from this meeting and that we should know?
I'm going to get into that in 1 second, but I just want to pick up very quickly on what Nirmal said about the domestic politics. I think that a lot of times they put Biden in this position where he was forced to kind of draw this line in the sand and say, I'm going to make the state a pariah. And then all of the domestic considerations, the oil, the energy, all the other things, are forcing him to then, go 180. And just on transitioning to Putin, Tom Malinowski, who was the former Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, said to me for a piece I was writing about Saudi Arabia, and who is one of the biggest critics of the Saudis, said, we have one goal right now, and that's to beat Putin. And so this is not about human rights or Khashoggi or energy or anything. It's about getting our allies to stand with us against Vladimir Putin and what's
Tom Malinowski, of course, now is a congressman from New Jersey. So politics has now become part of
politics is really everything. But on the Putin issue, look, Vladimir Putin's global influence clearly has taken a dip, to say it mildly, over the war in Ukraine. But he still is trying desperately to keep that foothold, that influence in the Middle East. And this is, by and large, what that trip was about, to show that he's still relevant in the Middle East. You've seen over the last few months still, taking operations in Syria and Libya to really maintain that Russian footprint. Now, this is about solidifying the relationship with Iran. There's talk about him maybe buying weaponized drones that he can use in the war in Ukraine. This is also about Putin obviously concluding that the relationship with the West is kind of dead. And now he needs to go to some other of these states that are not necessarily aligned with the West, like Iran, like Turkey, and see, the kind of deal making and to see the kind of power that he can gain there. There was a deal negotiated by Turkey, who's also trying to increase its influence and its, wasta, as we say in the Middle East, in the region, to free up, a deal to export grain on ships through the Black Sea, hoping to get, some of this 20 million tons of grain and other agricultural products trapped in Ukraine. And Turkey is now going to be the kind of guarantor of this deal. The control center where everything is monitored is going to go through Turkey. And I think that says a lot now about Turkey's rising role in the region and all these kind of shifting sands. But Putin kind of concluding that I'm not going to be able to get a fair deal with the West. I'll have, states like Iran and Turkey do my bidding.
I think Elise really lays it out nicely in terms of the Putin's desire to find new friends, and he needs them because he's losing some old friends.
Yeah.
And so, how do you think he succeeded in this, and can he build on it? And also, this deal that was just announced, signed between Ukraine and Russia to allow the grain shipments, and Turkey's and the UN, by the way, the UN Secretary General is very much involved in this role. Implementation, of course, to be TBD, but a big deal, a movement forward.
It's a huge deal. I don't think we can say that enough. This is something they've been working towards for a very long time. And this is the part of the war in Ukraine, I think, gets some attention, but not enough sometimes. We are facing a very serious global food crisis. And every time I talk to the head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, he underscores again just how dire the situation is. It was dire before the war began. He was out on the road trying to get countries to up their contributions, to raise the alarm, to, tell people we got to act now. Before the war began, it's only gotten worse since, just because of the world's reliance on grain exports from the region, from Russia and Ukraine. So I think there is a hope that this deal will now ease some of that burden. We're nowhere near out of the woods when it comes to that global food crisis, though. So that is one good thing I think we can point to today. On the friends issue, really depends on how you define friendship, right? I mean, when you talk about these nations coming together, I thought Elise pointing to Syria and noting that is something we shouldn't lose sight of, because as much as President Erdogan from Turkey needs to be seen as a global leader. He's facing incredible domestic pressure back home and a re-election campaign coming up, and he needs some wins to point to. Putin similarly wants to be seen on that world stage and still be seen, as a superpower, and we're engaging on these issues. We can lead the way when it comes to a conflict like Syria as well. But at the same time, it does all come back to the war in Ukraine in some ways. Russia's seriously extended its military capacity in Ukraine. And defense officials will tell you the rate at which they are launching some of these strikes is unsustainable over time. there is a very complicated and delicate balance between these powers at play in Syria right now, and Putin cannot afford for that equilibrium to be thrown off balance either. So there's kind of a couple of missions at play for Vladimir Putin when it comes to meeting with Iran and Russia right now, and Iran and Turkey rather, and talking about Syria in that way. So friends in so much as they all have a shared interest in maintaining the equilibrium in that region right now.
Yeah, and the other thing that might upset the equilibrium, of course, is that the Turks have announced, and Erdogan wants to grab a bigger slice of Syria as a buffer zone, and is threatening to invade. And the Iranians, of course, are there, and the Russians, of course, are there, complicating that as well. Just a side note here. Yesterday, Richard Moore, who is the head of MI6. In one of his rare public appearances in Aspen, which is where I am at the moment, said with regard to the Russians that the Russians were running out of steam, both in terms of manpower and materiel. So this is a top intelligence official in the UK with close connections to the US saying that on the record, and just to underscore, I think, the difficulty that Putin faces in the military side and the balancing act he confronts there.
I think though, Ivo, it's really important not to count him out. And Russia is going to continue to be a very important player in the Middle East. He's creating world havoc on everything we've talked about to this point. I mean, he's, basically creating havoc throughout the world, and holds even as weakened and as sanctioned and as hated and as everything as he is, he's calling a lot of the shots right now. And so, maybe over the long term, gradually, but I don't think we're going to see some kind of, Arab Spring type situation in Russia. I don't think that he's going to lose influence among, some of these other countries. We talked about the Middle East and all these Gulf countries. They're not ending their associations with Russia, not at all. They still want to maintain very warm relations with Russia, not just to hedge their bets against kind of the United States and China, but also for energy purposes. And also, if you look at Israel, Israel is not really going whole hog with the United States on Ukraine. And so I think there is, clearly he's weakened, clearly he's losing steam. But I think that there is this kind of psychological strategy by the Western powers to make it as if Putin is kind of on his way out or, spiraling down. I think certainly he's, weakened, but I wouldn't count him out.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Nirmal, jump in here.
No. I was just going to say I totally second what Elise said. I think it would be a grievous error to write off Putin. He can, even in just purely military terms, all he has to do is stand back and lob missiles at Ukraine once in a while and just maintain the war ad nauseum. Honestly, because and wait for the entire global economy to tank.
I do want to get to Sri Lanka, but Nirmal, one other, I think, important point to point out. Vladimir Putin and the Russians have been going around and telling that the food crisis in the world is due to U.S. and European sanctions. And in many ways, that narrative has gained a hold in places like Africa and apparently in the Middle East, where Biden, in his trip, was constantly reminded that the food crisis was very real for folks in the Middle East who depend, in fact, on Russian and particularly Ukrainian wheat. Now that there's a deal, which is not lifting sanctions, and if grain starts to flow, that argument sort of loses steam, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does to some degree, yes. Yeah. It depends on the nature of the deal, whether it's sustained and whether it works. But there are other factors. I mean, food is one aspect. The other aspect, the possibly bigger aspect, is energy. So, getting food around the globe is going to be a problem.
So, Nirmal, in the few minutes we have left, let's talk about Sri Lanka. You already mentioned the climate crisis, the food crisis. Talk about a perfect storm, really leading to a massive crisis in a country. And we'll take Sri Lanka because that's what's happening today. But frankly, it could happen almost everywhere else around the world. It's not particular to the nation of Sri Lanka, although there are particular reasons why Sri Lanka may be collapsing now. So bring us up to date and any hope with the new government that things might be turned around.
In just a few minutes, or do we have a couple of hours for that? No.
Just a few minutes. You're a journalist. You can, what's the headline?
So
essentially,
yeah. So the latest, of course, is that 2 days ago on July 28th, the parliament voted Ranil Wickremesinghe as president to replace Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who fled and is currently apparently in Singapore. But he has left. He has a country in which 6.3 million people, according to the World Food Programme, that's almost a third of the population. And the WFP just released this a couple of hours ago. 6.3 million people are food insecure. And the World Food Programme said this is likely to deteriorate as this crisis unfolds. And it does continue to unfold because Ranil Wickremesinghe is not exactly popular. And Sri Lanka remains in a very volatile state of flux. In the last 48 hours, roughly since his appointment, we've seen the army disperse protesters and destroy their encampment on Galface Green. A very sad state of affairs for a country that once led South Asia in almost every human development metric. So, you said we've used the word perfect storm in this conversation, but it really does apply to Sri Lanka, even leaving aside the civil war, which sort of ended in an exceptionally bloody manner in 2009. The proximate causes of this current crisis are many, and I'll quickly list them. Because they've all fed into each other. Sri Lanka was unable to service its debt to China for the Hambantota port project, handed the port to China on a 99-year lease. Then it was hit by the COVID pandemic, tourism vanished, remittances from overseas Sri Lankan workers crashed. Also fallout of the pandemic, tea exports plunged, the Ukraine war shock, as we know, disrupted supply chains further and pushed energy prices up. Then, meanwhile, along the way, President Rajapaksa mandated organic farming. Farmers were not prepared. You can't switch an entire country from fertilizer dependency to organic in a hurry. He slashed taxes, so state revenue plunged. The country went bankrupt. It exhausted its reserves. In April, it defaulted on its debt. It could not even pay for fuel sitting in tankers offshore waiting to be delivered. So the IMF has held discussions last month in June, but because of the chaos, nothing much has emerged, and everybody else is now waiting for the IMF to take the lead because nobody wants to lend to Sri Lanka because you likely not get your money back. So there are some lessons here. This is a product of a system in which political elites are corrupt, populists running the country as clans, as if the country is a personal fiefdom, and of course, blatant nepotism. Until recently, as many as 6 Rajapaksas held government positions, overseeing something like 70% of the national budget, one family. And of course, we mustn't forget, why was China financing chosen for Hambantota in the first place? Because Hambantota is Rajapaksa's hometown. So there again, you see the pattern. So all this is also underpinned by Sinhala majoritarianism and persecution of ethnic minorities. The Sinhala monks, the Theravada monks of Sri Lanka, are the most stridently chauvinist of all, blood-curdling stuff, really. In fact, Myanmar's Buddhist monks have learned from Sri Lanka's monks. And second, of course, terrible decisions, bad macroeconomic policies, and the broader takeaway is this is an object lesson on the risk of betting on China and falling into debt traps. China, at the Rajapaksa's invitation, became Sri Lanka's main banker and builder. Today, ironically, it is not China, but India, which doesn't want to see massive instability again in Sri Lanka. India has given it something like $4 billion through aid, loans, credit lines this year alone, just to keep it going. So this is, in a way, a win for India. The overarching lesson being, who will come to your rescue when the chips are down? Back to Ranil, deeply unpopular. He is seen as an ally of the Rajapaksas, whom the Sri Lankans hold responsible for the state of affairs, but it is complicated. Now, the Wickremesinghe clan belongs to an affluent, westernized, English-speaking elite minority that shaped the country since its independence in 1948. The Rajapaksas, on the other hand, come from a rural landowning clan, very steeped in the Sinhala Buddhist ethos, and have struggled at times to become part of the westernized Colombo elite. So now we have an unholy alliance of these strange bedfellows. And a lot of people suspect this is about salvaging the Rajapaksa clan. Ranil Wickremesinghe is being called the man with no mandate. So I should stop here at the risk of going on and on, but we should remember that the situation is in flux as we speak. And frankly, anything could happen. And we have to watch this space very closely, not least because of the lessons I mentioned, but the implications for the region, most importantly for India, which also doesn't have bottomless coffers to bail out a country the size of Sri Lanka.
We're out of time, but any reflection on it, which I think is a 4-minute lesson of what's happening, not only in the specifics of Sri Lanka, but the larger global context within it, which takes place, which was really, Nirmal, was great.
I was just going to say, how are you going to ask me to follow that? I mean, that was like the most incredible, succinct 3 to 4 minute understanding. I think everyone should just listen to if you're trying to understand what's going on in Sri Lanka and the region. I couldn't do it better than Nirmal right there. But I will just say, as a journalist, what a time to be alive. I mean, to watch what has been unfolding at the rate at which it unfolded, to see hordes of protesters taking over a presidential mansion and jumping on the president's bed and swimming in his pool, and all because of that perfect storm that, people had just had enough, as Nirmal just laid out there. I think I also want to underscore how at a different time in our world history, what happened and is happening in Sri Lanka would be a much bigger story and would be getting much more attention than it is right now. But it will have absolute consequences, not just for the people of Sri Lanka, not just for its neighbors, but for the rest of the world as well. So I will be among those closely watching.
Well, and we'll be watching here as well, and we'll be back again next week with another view about what's happening in the week. And God, we have, as Amna said, we have enough news to cover each week. It's almost exhausting, but it's important that we do this each week. And I'm so grateful to Amna Nawaz, to Elise Labott, and Nirmal Ghosh for joining us this week on a review of what happened in the world. We'll be back again next week. Until then, bon weekend.